There have been educated women through history, but education was usually restricted to the well-off. In ancient Egypt, some women could read and write. The Egyptians had a goddess of writing called Seshat. There were female doctors in ancient Egypt. One famous one was called Merit Ptah. There were also highly educated women in ancient Greece. One of them was Sappho, a woman poet who lived around 600 BC. Later, Theano of Crotona was a famous mathematician. In the Roman Empire, both girls and boys went to a kind of elementary school. Usually only boys went on further, but girls from rich families were very often educated at home by a tutor. One example of a highly educated Roman woman was Hortensia. She was a famous orator in the 1st century BC. There were highly educated women in Europe in the Middle Ages. One example is Trota of Salerno. She was a famous doctor around 1100. In the 12th century, a woman called Hildegard was a famous writer. She was a naturalist and a theologian. She also composed music. In the late Middle Ages, in the 14th century and the 15th century, literacy became more common. Perhaps about 1/3 of the population could read and write. Many middle-class women were literate. In the 15th century in England, Margaret Paston was a middle-class woman. She wrote some letters that have survived. She was a very strong-willed woman. She had to be to survive in those days. In the 16th century, some middle-class women were taught to read and write by their mothers or their husbands. Upper-class women were taught by tutors. There were a number of women writers and poets in the 16th century. One of them was Catherine Parr, wife of Henry VIII. In the 17th century, boarding schools for girls opened in many English towns. In the 18th century, some girls were taught to read and write at schools called dame schools. There were also charity schools for boys and girls called blue coat schools because of the colour of their uniforms. Girls from middle-class families like Jane Austen went to boarding schools. In Britain in the early and mid-19th century, the churches provided education for poor boys and girls. The state in Britain started providing education in 1870. In 1841, 3 women received degrees from Oberlin College. They were the first American women to receive degrees. In Britain, London University was the first university to give women degrees in 1880. In Britain, the minimum age for leaving school was raised to 14 in 1918, to 15 in 1948, and to 16 in 1973. In the 1960s in Britain, there was a huge expansion of further and higher education, and girls now have more opportunity for education than ever before.